Hey, you may be seated. Take your Bibles, turn them to Mark chapter 7, verse 24. Mark chapter 7, verse 24. Man, it's David's first time singing up here, and I love his manly voice. I was thinking, I bet every time you sing, like a man buys a power tool for the first time. You know, like a largemouth bass is caught. There's somebody builds a bonfire for the first time. Like I just envision manly things happening, right? Man. I want to tell you today there's one thing in the world that you definitely cannot trust, and it's an atom. You know why? They're always making stuff up. Nobody. Yeah, atoms make up everything. All right. Hey, I want to ask you a serious question, though. I just want to ask you a serious question. I know I got to kind of bring you down off of that dad joke high there. Serious question. Can you trust God? I didn't ask, is God trustworthy? I asked, can you trust God? Because see, when we think about trustworthiness and trusting in God, I'm not talking about can you trust God like students when you're taking a test in my class, can you like trust God that when you circled C and it was a guess that it might be right? I'm not talking about the person you have a crush on, you're like, hey, I'm going to text them and I'm just trusting that they don't ghost me and they respond back to me, right? I'm not talking about when your boss comes to you and says, hey, would you like this promotion? And you're like, I'm trusting God to say yes to this promotion. I'm talking about like God calls you to do something crazy. Like maybe read the Bible for the first time. Like to serve God. Like to give your life to God. Like to start tithing, like to start serving, like to be a spiritual leader in your home and lead a Bible study in your home, like to really begin praying some big prayers. Can you really trust God in those moments? Because here's what my fear is for a lot of us as Christians, because I've been there, is to say, God, you're trustworthy, but then when it comes down to it and God says, hey, take a leap of faith into something you don't know and you can't see how it's going to work out, and we're like, God, you're trustworthy. And we sing the songs about trusting God, but it's another thing to actually live and trust God in the moment when we don't know if it's going to work out. It's for a Christian that says, hey, I have a testimony, I have a bunch of stuff in my past where I can say, God, you've led me to do this. And God, in following you and doing this, God, there were so many moments along the way that if you didn't show up and if you didn't work and if you didn't do what only you could do and provide in ways that only you could provide, then God, you would have let me sink. And God, you showed up. And so we have those moments in our past that give us moments of faith in the present so that we can do things for God in the future, that we can obey in God, that we can follow God. And see, God's calling, I believe, a lot of us to do a lot of big things for God, a lot of things that are bigger than us, a lot of things that are like kingdom-sized things for God, things that require massive amounts of faith in us. And it's not just to say, God, you're trustworthy, but it's another thing to say, God, I can trust you by actually taking the step and then to keep walking. And then, God, when we fall down, for God to pick us up and carry us. See, the disciples right now are in a place where they've been learning a lot of things about Jesus. And it's easy for us to kind of throw some shade at the disciples sometimes because we read the story and we're like, golly, those disciples, they just didn't get it, did they? And then it's a gut check to realize there's a lot of times that we just don't get it either. And the disciples are learning and learning and learning. They've been seeing a lot of things about Jesus in these past 7 chapters. And today when we pick up with them, they're leading up to really this big question that's going to happen later in chapter 8, verse 29, which I believe is kind of like the crux of the book where really everything pivots off of. Think of like a hinge on a door, that this is kind of the pivoting thing of the whole book. And it's this question Jesus asks to his disciples. He prefaces the question by asking this, who do people say I am? But then he looks at his disciples and he says, who do you say that I am? Because see, the disciples have been watching Jesus and learning from Jesus, and we've been watching things about Jesus happen. If you've been coming to church, you've probably been watching other people's lives, seeing how other people do things, seeing what God does in their life, and you've been learning and taking stuff in. But when it really boils everything down, here's the question Jesus asks of all of us. Who do you say I am? Because there's a lot of answers to that question. We say, oh, he's just a big guy up in the sky, then we can blow him off and do whatever we want to down here. If we say he's our Savior, then when we get into a bad moment, we want God to save us out of things instead of walking through and turning those bad moments into testimonies. If we say he's the Lord of our life, then we're saying, God, I'm committing everything to you no matter what happens. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to trust in you. If we say he's just like our bro, we hang out with him, then when that life is good, we want to hang out. We want to talk. We want to be around Jesus. When we say, hey, he's the one he's a miracle worker, then the mundane, we don't really pray to Jesus. We don't have a relationship with God. But man, when life falls apart, we're like, Lord, I know you haven't heard from me in a long time, but please, right? Like that's how we begin to pray. And it comes back to, can we trust in Jesus? I want to show you 4 things today from chapter 8. I want to kind of catch you up on what we're going to miss out on in chapter 7 to preface everything in chapter 8 by telling you what we're kind of looking over. In chapter 7, verses 24 through 30, Jesus goes with his disciples and takes his disciples along. And at this point, Jesus has primarily been doing ministry to people called the Jews, the people who think about all the way back to creation, Adam and Eve. Then eventually we got Abraham, and Abraham was Father Abraham, right? He had many sons. I'm not going to sing the rest of it, and your ears will start bleeding if I start singing. I'll get David or Adam to sing it, right? But here's what happens. God puts these people into the world who are to bless the world by bringing people into relationship with him, and they are called the Jews. Unfortunately, the Jews, after disobeying God, are being punished by things. We talked about the Sanhedrin. We talked about a lot of things last week about why we're being punished, about obeying God and all those things. And so the people of God, the Jewish people, think that they're it, that they're kind of like the last hope for humanity kind of a thing, that they're the people who, if God is going to do something, he's going to do it in them. And then Jesus blows everybody's mind by in these verses 7:24 through 30 of chapter 7. Jesus goes to a non-Jewish woman, a Gentile, which if you're not Jewish descent, like I'm not, then we are Gentiles. So we are outside of the people of God. And it blows their mind. And he goes to this woman and heals her demon-possessed daughter, cast out a demon, to basically say, hey, I have authority even outside of these people who we think should be able to fit in, who we think are only the people of God, who we think are the only people God speaks to. I'm going to go to these people who are outside, and I'm going to bring them in to what God is doing through Jesus, right? So he does that in verses 24 through 30. Then in verses 31 through 37, Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. So he goes to the man, opens up the man's ears where he can hear and speak. Then this man goes about telling everybody who Jesus is, and then we get into chapter 8. And I want to show you a couple things today. I'm not going to ask you to stand because we're just going to kind of skip around all over the chapter 8. But I want to show you the first thing, and it's this. Jesus is fuller than desolate places. Jesus is fuller than desolate places. As I just said in chapter 7, Jesus is taking his mission out to Gentiles, out to people who are outside of the religious crew, outside of the religious team, outside of the people who have been in church all their life, outside of the people who wear their Sunday best to church, outside of the people who have the Jesus bumper sticker on their, well, they wouldn't have Jesus bumper sticker then. The ones who had WWJD on their car, right? They probably would have had that. So Jesus takes the mission outside of those people to the people who are on the outside who don't feel like God wants them, because the people of God had made them feel unwanted. Have you ever felt like God didn't want a relationship with you because the people of God didn't want a relationship with you? It's really easy for us in life to, just feel like God does not want a relationship with us because of things we've done. Because we feel like we're the ones who are on the outside, and those people inside the church, they're on the inside, they get it, and those people that sing those things and talk those ways, they're the people that get it. And it's easy even for people who come to church to feel like there's like an inside group and then we're on the outside sometimes. And the incredible thing is that this passage is included in here because Mark is writing to a group of people who are Gentiles, who have come to faith in Christ. And it's an incredible thing for these non-Jewish people to pick up their Bible and read that Jesus is ministering to the people who sometimes don't feel like they could be loved and feel like, hey, they don't fit in. And it's encouragement to us that if we feel that way sometimes, to remember that Jesus left heaven, came down to earth, and went to people who don't deserve a relationship with God, like you and me, to save you and me, to have a relationship with you and me. It's an incredible thing. In fact, just look down at verse number 2 of chapter 8. Verse number 2, chapter 8. Jesus is in front of 4,000 people teaching who are not Jewish people. They're Gentiles. And listen to what he says. I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from afar. Now, here's what I want you to notice about the passage. If you remember back to when Jesus fed the 5,000, what happened when Jesus fed the 5,000? What happened was the disciples looked at Jesus and said, Jesus, it's getting late. Send all these people home. Let them figure it out themselves. And Jesus said, whoa, disciples, hold up. I care about everybody. Since you're going to send them away, why don't you feed them? And put it back on the disciples. And the disciples are like, whoa, Jesus, we can't do anything. But they found the little boy, as the book of John tells us, and the little boy had some fish, he had some bread, and they brought it. So they literally stole a kid's food, right? And gave it to Jesus, and Jesus blessed it and fed 5,000 people, and there's 12 baskets of bread left. Scholars believe that in that first miracle, that miracle of the 5,000, with the 12 baskets being left, it's to symbolize that Jesus is doing a ministry to the 12 tribes of Israel. Each basket represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then here in this passage, Jesus is in front of 4,000 people, and instead of Jesus looking at the disciples or the disciples pushing people away, Jesus says, hey guys, I have compassion on them, just like the other people. I love them. We're going to care for them as well. Isn't it easy to, as we said a moment ago, to kind of throw some shade at the disciples and say they just don't get it? Because if you read verses 1 through 10, they're still like, Jesus, all we got's a little bit here. Jesus like, yeah, but you got me here. You know what's really easy to do is in the middle of trying to serve God and follow God and obey God. Sorry, y'all know I worked at the church yesterday. I can't stop coughing. It's really easy to do this. Jesus to say, hey, I want you to do this, but here's what we do. We look around and we're like, but God, don't you see the state of the economy over here? God, don't you see how I don't have the equipping to do what you're wanting me to do? God, don't you see that like I've got this going on in my life? God, don't you see that I need to get some things straight at work? God, don't you see that I've got to get some stuff straight in my family? God, don't you see? And the list just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. And here's what we do. We allow desolate places to influence our faith to being a desolate faith. Instead of realizing if Jesus is with us and calling us to it, he'll equip us and he'll walk in it with us. Then when we look back at things and we're going, I don't know. We can so devalue Jesus and say, Jesus, we trust you, but I can't actually like follow you here because I just don't know if you can do this or not. Amen. For a lot of us, we have stories in our past of Jesus doing things in our life when it seemed like there was nothing going to happen. We got people in our church that if you just talk to people and listen to people talk and ask them, hey, how did God move in your life and do this in your life? Then people will say, man, you can't believe this story. Just this morning I was talking to one of the people in the early service, and we were talking about something in the life of the church, and they said, man, if you ever need a story about this, I've got you. I said, do tell. So they start telling, and I was like, wow, like that's incredible that God's doing that in your life. And literally what they said was, it didn't make sense, but I just trusted God, and God made it work. And when we begin to follow God, here's what God's going to do. He's going to put us into a desolate place that doesn't make sense to keep trusting, so that when it works out, we can't claim the glory and the honor for it. So that we can only say it was by the grace of God and the power of God that this came to be, so that he gets the glory and the honor. I love what Jesus does in verses 5 through 10, because he just reminds the disciples, hey, it's just a couple chapters earlier, guys. It was just a couple days ago, just a couple weeks ago, that you didn't get it. But remember, I was the one that multiplied it. I was the one that was fulfilling these things. I was the one that made all these things work. And when it comes to our faith, we don't need to evaluate Jesus by what's around us. We need to evaluate what's around us because of what we have in Jesus, because he is fuller than any desolate place. Second thing I want to show you is this. Jesus' ministry is the proof, not what we demand. Look down in verse number 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Have you ever met those people? Maybe you have some in your life that maybe you're at work or students are at school. Or maybe you just look from the other side of the house and they're walking towards you and you're like, here we go again, right? Like, they're about to argue with you. They're about to say, like, it could be beautiful and 75 outside, and they're like, there's a 20% chance of rain today. And you're like, right? Like there's negative, just fully negative. I could see Jesus being like, all right, here they come. Because look down in verse 12. And he sighed deeply in his spirit. You know what that means? Jesus went, oh. And then he said this, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. The Pharisees came to Jesus, said, Jesus, we need a sign from you to believe in you. Jesus said, peace out, Girl Scout, got in a boat and left. Anybody else stubborn in here just besides me? Some of you are like, I'm so stubborn, I ain't raising my hand. Jack gave us both hands back there, right? Some of y'all are like, man, my sides are sore now after asking that question because somebody beside you just went, that's you, right? That part of my stubbornness is people come up to me and say, hey, you can't do that. And I'm like, coffee and Jesus says I can, right? Or people are like, hey, you gotta learn how to do this. I'm like, okay, give me a YouTube video. Like, I can figure this out. Or it's just that negative thought of somebody telling me I can't do something. I'm like, watch me do it, all right? That it's that reverse psychology to get somebody to do something that the Pharisees are trying to use in this passage against Jesus. And Jesus has none of it. They ask for a sign from heaven. What does that mean? A sign from heaven is not like Jesus like opening up the Milky Way and being like, oh, look at all these beautiful stars. A sign from heaven was a term that was used for a judgment sort of a thing. So here's what they were literally asking Jesus to do. They were asking Jesus to do something that made them believe that Jesus was for them. Here's what they were asking for, basically. They were asking for, Jesus, will you take out the Roman authorities who are ruling us and restore back what we want life to be like? So literally, they were asking that Jesus would remove these people from their life. They were asking for Jesus to do something that was not about his ministry. And when Jesus didn't do it, you know what they didn't do? They didn't start believing. You know what the truth of the matter is? When people ask for signs to believe in Jesus, let's say that God gives them that sign. You know what rarely happens? They start believing in Jesus. Because here's what they say, well, if God can do that, give me one more. If God can do that, then I just want one more thing. And here's what it becomes. It doesn't become about believing and surrendering to Jesus. It becomes about fulfilling me and my desires. And here's what Jesus has been doing. Jesus, from early on in the book of Mark, has been meeting with these Pharisees. And at first, he began to teach them. And at first, he began to instruct them. At first, he would respond to their questions. But now he's like, guys, I've shown you so much stuff. If you're not going to believe what I've shown you, I'm not going to show you and waste my time by giving you one more thing that you're not going to believe in. Just believe in me or not. Believe in the ministry or don't. And when it comes to Jesus, you and I don't need more signs. We need more faith. We have the entire Bible. The entire Bible. That people have been trying to squash and cut out and kill for all of its history. And it's got some of the most incredible things recorded in it that we could ever possibly believe in, that could possibly grow our faith. We've got other Christians who have experienced things and walked through things and have testimonies of God doing things that could only be God. We don't need another sign. We just need to surrender to God. The greatest thing that Jesus has ever done for us to believe in him is that he came from heaven to earth, went to a cross and died, and then resurrected. And you're like, but yeah, that's cool, but Ryan, that's just like religious myth. Okay, let's test it. I'll give you 3 reasons this morning to believe in the resurrection of Jesus that are not in the Bible. But first, I'm going to show you one that right now is in the Bible. You're like, that's cheating. No, because every single book of the Bible now was once a separate document to the Bible that got included into the document of the Bible. So when I reference 1 Corinthians 15, like I'm going to right now, at one point in time, it was just a letter. It wasn't anything that was specifically in the Bible. Yes, it talked about things about Jesus. Yes, it talked about all those things that are important. But look at what happens in verse number 6 of chapter 15. Paul, let me unpack for you who Paul was for a second. Paul was a guy who, at one point in time, he would have had a Jewish name and a Greek name. It would have been likely Saul, Paulos, and then his last name, whatever his last name was. It wasn't that like all of a sudden when he got saved, God really changed his name. I know we've heard that, but he would have had a Jewish name because of his Jewish heritage and a Greek name for doing business. So when he begins to write letters to Greek-speaking people, which name does he use? Paul. That's what we have. You see when he's in Jewish circles, he goes by Saul because that's just how he fit in and talked to people. So this guy, who is a high-up Jewish ruling Pharisee, who had it made, he had all the money, he had everything that he could possibly want as a Jewish leader, was killing people who believed in the resurrection of Jesus, killing Christians. Had an encounter that only he could say that he had because nobody else saw it, and then all of a sudden reversed sides and began to be the greatest supporter of the people he used to kill. Even when he gave his life to Christ, people were like, I ain't hanging out with Paul. I ain't doing it. He killed people I used to worship with. He is not coming into my house. He is not coming into our church. He's a spy. And God's like, guys, welcome him in. Bring him in. Encourage him. Teach him the ways. And what he does in 1 Corinthians 15 is he writes a letter about 15 years after the fact that Jesus has resurrected. And he writes some things that have been taught to him and told to him. But one of the things that he writes is so incredible, we have to look at it and validate it as fact. And here it is, verse number 6. After that, he, speaking about Jesus, was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Why did he write that? Because Paul wrote that to basically say, hey guys, if you don't believe me, if you don't believe Peter, if you don't believe the apostles who were listed earlier, if you don't believe the church leaders, go investigate and be a reporter and ask these questions of people. Check it out for yourselves. Investigate it. And you're like, but I really need something right now. No, you don't. You don't need proof right now that Jesus resurrected, because you can look back at historical documents that prove that Jesus resurrected and believe in those. If you believe that the people like, my mind just went blank, Alexander the Great are real, who wasn't written about for like hundreds of years after the fact, though we have barely any recorded evidence of Alexander the Great at all that he's real, then you've got way more proof of Jesus. I'll give you the second thing. There was a guy by the name of Josephus. Josephus was another Jewish person who was against the things of Christianity. He wrote a lot of history for the Roman Empire. In writing for the Roman Empire, he wrote a lot of things down as fact. One of the things that he wrote down, listen to what he wrote in one of his most famous writings. He said, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, so basically he's saying, hey, I was there, I met with Pilate, I made this recommendation to him, had condemned him, speaking of Jesus, to the cross, that those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. Here's the key. For he appeared to them alive again the third day. That's an extra biblical source that's validating something that's said in the Bible. That it's not just a religious myth. That there's somebody outside of Christianity that's saying, hey, this really happened and we're writing about it. And you say, well, okay, but why didn't the Romans write about killing Jesus? Let me ask you, why would they write about killing a criminal when they killed thousands of criminals every single day? That's all they viewed Jesus as, was a criminal. I'll give you the third thing of information. The third thing is the mentioning in the passage about Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. That when we mentioned in the passage, I didn't mention it, when the Bible mentioned that Jesus was put into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, that was key because the tomb was connected to Joseph, who was part of the high court of the Jews, and to be connected to the high court of the Jews and then to drop that name into the passage was basically for the writer, for Mark, to basically say, hey, if you want to check me, if you want to investigate this, go look at it. And there's been no sources to come out and say it wasn't Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, meaning it was real. Jesus really died and really wasn't in the grave. That, listen, we don't need more arguments. We don't need more signs. We need hearts that are open to say, God, I can't keep arguing against you. I just have to believe. The third thing about believing in Jesus is this. Jesus wants faith with a memory. Jesus wants faith with a memory. Look down in verse number 17 of chapter 8. The disciples are arguing with one another about they've only got one piece of bread. Who's going to eat it? Who's going to break it up? Who's going to bring Jesus over and be like, hey, Jesus, bless this bread. Multiply it for us, Jesus. Give us some fish and feed us. Look at verse 17. Jesus, aware of them arguing, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand, or your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not yet see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? I said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? The question is this: do you not remember to trust right now? You know, when it comes to faith, aren't our memories really, really short when it comes to trusting in God? It's like, God, I got this big thing right now that I'm trusting you for, and God, man, it's big, it's scary. I just don't know if I can trust you. And God's like, literally 2 weeks ago, you had a moment like that, and I worked. Remember that. It's like, okay, God, now I'm trusting you. God, I'm scared, though. I know you're calling me to this. God, I just don't know. I know I heard that testimony about that person the other day and how you moved in their life and how you did all these things, but God, I just don't know. And God's like, remember. Just remember, have faith from memory. You know, one of the things that the Bible commands us over and over and over from the Old Testament all the way to the New Testament is one thing: remember. Remember. Because, man, we're in the moment of having to decide if we can trust in God. And we look out and we feel like we're in a desolate place. We feel like we're not going to make it. You know what happens? The negative can win out. That says God won't move. God won't work. God doesn't love you. God isn't faithful. This is going to be the time that you got it wrong. There's all these things that whisper to us. You know what I've had to find in my life? It's I got to preach testimonies of how God's moved in my past so that in the present I'll trust Him. I have to say, God, I remember when I was trusting in you, I didn't see how it was going to work out, and I was ready to bail. And God, you came through. And God, when you came through, I remember that. So God, I'm going to trust you now. I have to say, I remember that story that so-and-so told, what happened to them, and God, I'm just going to declare that over my life right now. I'm just going to remind myself that I can trust in you, not that their testimony does something for me, but God, it reminds me that you're faithful. And God, I'm going to trust you in this moment. Because memory is so powerful for us to trust. And some of us this afternoon, what we need to do after we eat, just to talk with our family and say, hey, let's just remember some good things that God's done in our life and write them down. This may be a little dorky, but I've got a folder on my computer called encouragement. And a lot of you have taken time to email me, text me, different things that have happened in your life that's been very encouraging about how God's moved, about you've been praying these things, and God answers this prayer. And what I do is I'll take a screenshot of that, and I'll move it over into my encouragement folder. I'll also make a note on my computer, like if anything, like I've been really praying for God to do something, I'll write that down, and I'll move it over into my encouragement folder. Because on days that I am being discouraged, I need encouragement. And I go back and I pull those up, and it's just like testimony after testimony, list after list, and getting to see that God's done this and this and this and this and this. I'm like, okay, God, let's do it, right? Like, God, let's get it. Give me the water pistol and take me to hell. Like, let's go right now, right? Like, I'm ready to go, Jesus, because we need memory. Because Satan loves to come and tell us everything that won't work and forget how full Jesus is. He will work. The fourth thing I want to show you is this. It's a question. Do you see anything? Do you see anything? Verses 22 through 25 there, Mark finishes up the section, verse 26, and he's healing a blind man. Jesus goes up to the blind man and spits in his eyes. Wouldn't you love that to be your healing story, right? You get to church, how did Jesus heal you? Well, he spit in my eyes first, and then he rubbed my eyes. But Jesus spits into his eyes, rubs his eyes, and then asks this question. Do you see anything? And the man says, well, I see people, but they're like trees moving. Jesus says, okay. So the man closes his eyes. Jesus puts his thumbs on his eyes again. He prays. And he says, do you see anything? And the man opens his eyes, and he's healed. You can see. Scholars believe that some of the things that Mark does with stories is Mark puts some stories into his gospel as a thematic story to teach us a point. And this is one of those stories. Because the question that Jesus is asking is, do you see anything that I have done? Is it working in your life? And it's really a question back to the disciples and to us as the readers of what have we seen so far in the book of Mark? What have we seen about Jesus that we can trust in him? What have we seen about Jesus that, remember, in verse 29, we could answer the question, who do we say that Jesus is? Have we seen anything? Have what we've seen been enough to show us who Jesus really is? In 1859, in the summer of 1859, a guy by the name of Charles Blondin, he was an entertainer. He would go out onto high wires, and he would walk across things. He would do crazy trapeze acts. I can't even say it. And he went to Niagara Falls one day, and in front of a crowd, he started on the American side, and he walked across a tightrope to the Canadian side over the falls, 160 feet over the falls, and came back. Not one time, not two times, not three times, not four times, around a dozen times, and carried stuff with him every time he went. One of the craziest things that he did was he carried a stove across, and it wasn't just like a cool stove, it wasn't just a hangout stove, it was a stove that was turned on, and he cooked an omelet on it while he walked across. Like, what a man, right? But for his final act, he came back and he got a wheelbarrow. When he got the wheelbarrow, he put tons of rocks in it. He put it onto the wire. He put it down for a second, and he grabbed a blindfold and put the blindfold around his eyes. Grabbed it and started walking across. And people went, ooh. And the wind would blow, and he'd kind of tip over a little bit, and he'd bring it back, and everybody would go, wow. He got over the other side and was in Canada, and everybody's like, yeah! You know, they're screaming, they're hollering, like, yes, this is awesome! So he says, I'm coming back. So he turns around and he walks back. Now, these are people who've been there all day long, watching Mr. Blondin walk on this tightrope, go all the way across, all the way back. Mr. Blondin put down the wheelbarrow. He took all the rocks and he laid them all to the side, and he yelled to the crowd and said, hey, who wants to see me take a person across in the wheelbarrow? And everybody went, yeah, right? And they're all looking around. They're expecting somebody to walk out and get into the wheelbarrow. And then here's the thing that he does that blows everybody's mind. He says, who wants to get in? Now remember, they've watched the man walk across and come back dozens of times, cook an omelet, do it with a wheelbarrow full of rocks, the weight of a person. He's trustworthy. He's already proven he can do it. No problem. But don't you know there's a difference between somebody being trustworthy and us trusting them? Don't we know that God has proven himself trustworthy? But the question comes, can you trust him? Can I tell you what my fear is? My fear is God's done a lot of amazing things in individual lives in this room, in the life of our church, going across tight ropes and coming back and just blowing our minds. And then he's going to look at some of us and even sometimes us as a church and says, all right, you've seen me do it. You ready to get in? You ready to go for a ride? You ready to take part in something that you could never do by yourself? It's going to be scary. But I got you. I'm trustworthy. We're going to cheer and hoop and holler and look for somebody else to do it, instead of doing it ourselves. And we're going to stay sitting on the sides and miss the most incredible story, the most incredible things God could do in our life. Because we're like, God, you're trustworthy, but we never get in the wheelbarrow and trust him. And here's what I believe. I'm talking about that right now. I think there's probably some people in here right now that there's some things that are your wheelbarrow right now. Relationships, financial, health, work, spiritual. That God says, let me have it. And you're like, whew, God, you're trustworthy, but man, I can't do that one. We're going to miss it. God's just saying to us this morning as a reminder, hey, I'm trustworthy, so just trust me. So right now, with every head bowed and every eye closed, I want to ask you, what is it that God's speaking to you this morning that you need to trust him in? That it's time to get into the wheelbarrow. Maybe you're here this morning and there's just some sin that you kept kind of quiet. It's comfortable. It feels good. Nobody knows about it. And God keeps saying, stop. I've got better for you. And stopping it is getting in the wheelbarrow. Because you don't know what life is going to be like without it. Maybe there's some of us here this morning that there's a situation at work or home or school that we really need God to move in. We just got to turn it over to God and say, God, I'm getting in the wheelbarrow. And there's some of us that we've been maybe not living at a distance, but we know that we could be closer to God. And there's just some things God's calling us to trust him in. We're just like, God, I don't know if I can get into that wheelbarrow. Maybe you've been saved, but you never gotten baptized. Like, I just don't know. Scared, it's kind of awkward getting in front of people. And God's like, get in the wheelbarrow. Just trust me. Maybe you've been feeling called to serve and be a part of a ministry here at the church, and you're just like, man, I just don't feel equipped. I just don't feel ready. And God says, sign up. Jump into the wheelbarrow. Maybe it's tithing. It just doesn't make sense financially, and it's like, God's like, just jump into the wheelbarrow. Maybe it's inviting that person to church with you, telling somebody about Jesus, and God says, just jump in the wheelbarrow. Maybe you're here this morning and you know that you have never given your life to Jesus. You've never asked for forgiveness of your sins. You've never dedicated your life to Him. You got a lot of questions and a lot of doubts. You've been waiting on a sign, and here's what you realize this morning. It's not going to happen. Because the death, burial, and resurrection is all the sign that you need. And this morning, it's time just to say, God, I'm jumping in the wheelbarrow, and I'm giving you my life. All of it. Do whatever you see fit. What is it that God's leading you to do this morning? Just these next few moments, spend just some time in prayer before the Lord, asking God to have His way in your life and just committing to going all in and trusting in Him.